Most operators don't have a growth problem. They have a follow-through problem. Deals stall, conversations drift, and momentum quietly dies in the gaps. On Scale Smart, Grow Fast, that's exactly what we're going to dig into. And when you're buried in that, it's not just strategy, it's execution. That's why at Workergenics, we bring in full-time Ultimate Executive Assistants to lock in consistent follow-throughs so things actually move. Today's guest has spent over 4 decades in the game, building and scaling 7 businesses.
One of the cardinal sins that a lot of business owners make is they manage by numbers, not by behaviors. In the world of sales, the lagging indicator is the actual revenue that a salesperson can drag in, right?
Now he helps owners win through sales, leadership, and coaching. And he hates losing more than he loves winning. Let's get into it. Tim, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you so much, Harley, for having me on your wonderful podcast. Excited to share with you today.
Awesome. Glad you're here. I'd love for you to share a little bit about your background. What brought you to doing what you do today?
Well, I have a weird story in that I started my first company when I was 14 years old, out of greed and necessity, a little bit of both, and have been self-employed for the 43 years since. I've just figured out how to grow and scale companies. Now I spent the last 11 as a Sandler franchisee. So I do sales training, leadership training, executive coaching, and I'm helping all kinds of business owners across the country figure out how to scale and grow.
Awesome. Sounds like you've got a lot of experience and knowledge to share with our audience today. I'm really excited to get into it. Now, you say you've been in business for over 40 years. You've built several companies. When you look at operators today, where do you see things actually breaking between having a plan and getting real momentum?
I think it's a great question. The entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well in America, and it's evidenced by, even unusual things you wouldn't be like, oh, that's a real thing, right? Like, being a content creator, you have to be constantly, you're an entrepreneur, right? And where the wheels come off of the rails are when you're trying to scale beyond just, you. If you're the content creator, great, fine. You've got to figure out a scalable product or service to be able to hawk and to sell, because otherwise it's literally just you by yourself. You're a single solopreneur. But I do find that lots of hopes and dreams. The entrepreneurship always starts out with a dream, and then oftentimes the realities of the business world will consume that dream really quickly. And I think that that's got everything to do with how you build your team around you.
Yeah, awesome. Now, Tim, when we were getting started today, you shared how you've kind of a 4-point plan you work through with people. Could you share kind of what those key points are and maybe start diving into that first one?
Sure. The first thing that a successful entrepreneur is going to do is they're going to focus on building a successful sales team. And that's an important piece, of course. Again, if you're going to scale beyond just the founder of that organization, you've got to be able to empower and teach other people how to sell your product and your wares in order to achieve that. So the number one thing that I work with my clients on is you've got to create a amazingly effective hiring and onboarding process. So lots of people, might resort to using recruiters, which is fine, but you really should have your own, recruiting process in the first place. So when you're hiring, you've got the profile, you understand the characters and the traits of the person that you're looking for. You've got a well-defined job description that really lays out what is expected in the execution of that role. So sales, pretty simple. You want somebody that's goal-oriented. You want them to have a great internal engine, a motivation engine, if you will. You want them to be an astute learner, someone who asks great questions, has high self-awareness, and high emotional EQ. You want all those things inherently in that character because, first of all, to find somebody with all of those traits is pretty difficult. This is why we call it hiring and onboarding, right? The hiring part is only part of the equation. The onboarding is how you retain them. And what we know is that when you hire someone off the streets, for example, their resume stays out on the various job boards for up to a year afterwards. So they're still getting calls. And if you go through all of the expense and the agony of recruiting a high performer, you hire them, but you don't have a rock solid onboarding process, they're still getting calls from, other organizations. And so the onboarding piece is is just as important as the actual recruitment and hiring process itself.
One question on that finding and onboarding, I think a lot of people struggle with is like compensation models for salespeople. Do you have kind of general guidelines on that, whether it's like a split of commission and base salary, or does it really depend on the industry?
I think it depends on what your goals are. Now, what I've found is that the employers that use a commission only compensation program, those are the hardest jobs to fill because there's a learning curve for everything, right? So, for example, we just talked about hiring and onboarding. The onboarding process could take 90 days or more. And if you're a commission only, that could be a problem if you don't have the financial wherewithal to hang on for 90 days. But I also find that the commission only roles pay the best, right? If you can survive the onboarding process and come out of the blocks strong, you'll also by far make the most money. A lot of employers don't have a model like that. They will do a hybrid where there's a base salary of some sort just to kind of keep people alive. And of course the trick is if you make the base salary too high, do you end up with like lazy people that, don't maximize their efforts because they're comfortable in whatever that base salary is kind of carrying them. So there's always that danger. I particularly spent my whole life, I'm 100% commission. I only eat what I kill and drag back home. So I've always been a fan of, it's a high risk, but it's also a super high reward. That's the model that I like the best. It's not for most though.
Now, when you're stepping into a new business as a coach, what are some of the first things that you notice that aren't really moving, even though everything may look good on the surface?
One of the cardinal sins that a lot of business owners make is they manage by numbers, not by behaviors. And what I mean by that is when you look in the world of sales, the lagging indicator is the actual revenue that a salesperson can drag in, right? The leading indicator is the execution of the prospecting behaviors that result in the lagging indicator, the actual sale. And too many times business owners are focused on the actual revenue number as opposed to the leading indicator. Because I can tell you, for example, I'm an old Chicago White Sox fan. I grew up in Chicago. And if you know anything about Major League Baseball, the White Sox are one of the most horrific teams that there are. But they had a guy, this was in the mid 2000s, and his name was Adam Dunn. And Adam Dunn was a thumper. That dude would hit 40 home runs every year. But the problem is he'd also hit 175, and he'd strike out 230 times a year. He'd get it right 40 times a year. He'd crunch the ball, and everybody's excited, but he was also a killer because, he wasn't on base enough. In the world of sales, you want as many at bats as possible, and you're going to do your fair share of striking out. But, being in the batter's box in the first place is the behavior of learning how to hit a 95-mile-an-hour fastball that's thrown at your head, right? The home run is nice. It's sexy, but the more time you spend in the batter's box, the more hits you'll ultimately get. And so I hope I made that clear. The cardinal sin is that most people will manage by the lagging indicator.
I want to jump back into your main points again. We covered the first one. What's the second point?
The second point is to, build a high performing sales team, as you want to make sure that you train them appropriately, right? I think a lot of times an employer will go through the recruiting and the hiring and even the onboarding process, and they'll build those things out. And then there will be some level during the onboarding of training. Here's our company, here's our service or our product, here's, who we're looking for. And then they kind of pat you on the head at 90 days and say, all right, go get them, killer. And what we know is that that's a dangerous place. If you go through the effort to have a good recruiting, hiring, and onboarding process, you've got to provide development, professional development for even high performers. There's salespeople I break into three different categories. You've got a high performer, you've got a variable performer, and then the low performer. The low performer is someone who constantly, regularly misses their targets and their goals. The variable performer in the middle is going to, they'll get a hit one day and then they'll strike out three times the next. But your top performers are the ones that most business owners neglect the most in regards to professional development. And that's a mistake. right? They're like, oh, well, that's the one that's bringing in 80% of my revenues. I don't want to mess with that one. I don't want them upset and, whatever. So they let them be on their own. And it's a dangerous spot because, again, we live in a competitive world. And if the salesperson gets bored or feels neglected, if there's not any challenge for them in what they do, they'll get bored and they will look elsewhere. So training them, providing them with some professional development program is extremely important to retention.
Yeah. Well, that is perfect for a question I had for you as well, which is how do you see the sales skill development, that training that we just talked about, tying into a leader's ability to actually free up their time and maybe their team's time and also their trust in their sales team?
For sales leaders, what they'll often do, the most efficient ones will not waste their time doing the training. They will subcontract that out to someone like me, for example, right? They'll have me do it because that's the one thing I focus on. As a sales leader, you've got a bunch of different things to worry about. What we know is that when you're in a leadership position, and especially in sales, about 55% of your time as a sales leader, a sales manager, or a VP needs to be spent with, your people. And that could be ride-alongs and, doing reports and stuff like that. But the remainder, the other 45% of that time, you should spend 30% of that coaching, one-on-one coaching, and that's different from training. Of course, training I define as teaching someone a new skill. Coaching is helping someone take an existing skill that they have and apply it better and more effectively, in a given scenario. So if 55% of the time they're supposed to be like managing their people, 30% of it, now you're at 85%, 30% of that time should be spent coaching. And then you take training and mentoring, and you can take the remaining 15% and split it that way. That's the most effective division of labor that I would teach to sales leaders, if you would.
Yeah. Now, as an entrepreneur and business leader is getting into this time where they are starting to delegate sales and they're bringing on someone like you, what are some of the mindset shifts that you coach that helps them let go of the sales role without feeling like the standards are going to drop?
You're going to laugh when I even say this, but for the first 9 weeks of training in my world happens on a repetitive basis, and it happens over a period of time. Like I won't do sales boot camps, if you will, because my personal philosophy is, we've all gone to, motivational talks and boot camps that lasted a day or two. And we know that about 90% of the information that that you learn in those boot camps within 96 hours is you forgot it and you can never access it again. For me, training happens over a period of time, and we do it in 90 minutes classes each week, 44 weeks during the course of a calendar year. And so, delve that piece out, right? And the first 9 weeks, the managers will actually be in the training with their salespeople. And the reason that is because we want the sales managers to know, what framework am I teaching and downloading into their team? Because there's a second piece to this. I can deliver the training, but I'm also not there 24/7 afterwards. And so if the managers and leaders are in the first 9 weeks of training, for example, they'll understand fully the framework. And then I can coach the leaders and say, okay, here's how to hold your people accountable to what I'm teaching them. So you don't have to be in there for 44 weeks in a year. All you need is like the first 9, and then you've got the framework. I'll coach the leader through the framework.
If you're running a growing company and still handling too many operational details yourself, there's a better way forward. The Delegate or Die checklist shows you the exact tasks that drain leadership bandwidth and the simple changes that recover 15 to 30 plus hours a week. Download it free at workergenics.com/scale-smart. Now let's get back to the episode. Awesome. Well, let's jump back into your key points. We've covered the first 2. What's the third that you like to share with people?
Well, we did a little bit of jumping because we hit hiring and onboarding your top performers is massive. Training to execute the winning behaviors. The third one was the managing the behaviors, not the numbers. I can't stress this one enough because it's easy to fall in love with the end goal. There's an old saying that a stop clock is right at least twice a day. And it's true. You can have a salesperson that might be hitting their sales targets by closing 2 sales in a year. They could do exactly that. And you would think on the surface, oh, well, that one is, knocking it out of the park. They're hitting their goal every time, even though they're only closing 2 sales a year. The real question as a manager, you have to be looking at like what behaviors are being executed. Because if you're getting, say you only have 3 sales calls in the whole year and you're closing 2 of them, that's amazing. You have a 66% closing rate, right? But you're only doing 3 sales calls a year, which is, like what's the opportunity cost of only having those three? Well, what if they had 10 times that? What if they had 50 sales calls a year instead of, and you were at 2/3? At that point, you're, beyond a rock star at that point. There was a movie and a book called Moneyball that was written about the Oakland A's, and Billy Beane was the general manager of the Oakland A's in the 90s. And it was curious because he started to bring in baseball statistics into play, right? Like he relied less on the traditional old school, baseball scouting. And he started to look at like the metrics. And that's how we know that the top performing managers that have high performing sales teams, they manage by the execution of behaviors and measure those, because they know if you execute the winning behaviors, you're naturally going to get the result. It's going to make sense.
Now, if a manager is reviewing numbers and seeing that there might be a gap in where someone is performing versus where they'd like to be, can you maybe share a story where like some simple feedback or rhythm of, coaching has made a big difference in how that team performed?
Yeah, absolutely. So it happens all the time. And this is what good managers who are plugged into their team and invested in their team, they do automatically. I had a client who had 4 salespeople. One was, your top performer. One was a lower performer. But one of the 2 middle ones, they showed flashes of being able to go on hot streaks for long periods of time. They'd run into, a wall at some point. And as it turns out, when you're following a sales process, when your sales team is executing a sales process, you can actually debrief your sales calls. And if you're documenting the debriefs, for example, like in a CRM or something like that, it's incredibly helpful because you can start like seeing where it breaks down. So with Sandler, for example, it's a 7-step sales process. And in each step, there are benchmarks which you can measure. And so what we noticed was that variable performer that had the ability to shine and be a top performer for pretty long stretches, what happened would they would get comfortable, right? Because they were making tons of money while they were on the hot streak. And they would they would bail out of the pain conversation prematurely, right? They would get comfortable. They're like, I already hit my quota for the year, whatever. And so they would cut the pain step short. And that was the actual problem. So once the manager and I were able to determine that, the manager was able to coach that salesperson into, they weren't exactly like an A+ player, but they were an A- player, because you could see the dip in the numbers, and every time there was a dip in the numbers after going on a nice winning streak and all of a sudden you hit the wall, they were able to debrief that and say, okay, well here, and they would, the manager would coach that salesperson. And that had a massive impact. It was, like $1 million of additional revenue just by being able to recognize what was going on and then come up with a game plan to attack that problem. It was $1 million fix for that organization.
I bet that was hugely helpful too for the salesperson because maybe they were making that change just subconsciously because they felt comfortable. It wasn't even intentional.
Percent. And that's just it. It was such an unconscious thing that, well, again, once the sales manager was able to help the salesperson throw that awareness radar up, as soon as they felt the dip, they're like, oh, I'm doing it again. And then they can course correct on the fly. And then the dip was, minimal at best. Like I said, it went from, like a B player to like an A-. And that was enough to bring in an additional $1 million of revenue per year to the company. And the salesperson was just happy as can be because, he made way more money too.
For sure. Now, you've seen a lot of different team structures. I'm curious, in your experience, where have you seen the top performing sales teams and leadership teams leverage like executive assistants or virtual assistants to extend their capacity and get their time back?
Got some clients that leverage the virtual assistants, for example, to help with doing the CRM notes and stuff like that to update the CRM. I think that's probably the most important one that I've seen. Having someone to, do expense reports and the mundane kind of reporting tasks that a lot of salespeople have to do, most salespeople have to do. You can never go wrong by having an EA or a virtual assistant. It's just good best practices because, think about this. If you're a salesperson and your job is to be in front of a dozen face-to-face meetings with your ideal client profile, you're not getting paid to do paperwork, right? And that's the number one complaint is, I got to mess around with this stupid, CRM. If you have a virtual assistant in there or an assistant, an EA, they can do all that stuff. You can voice record your notes, send them to the EA. The EA can, do what they need to do in order to get in there. And so, yeah, those are ways that you can really, really maximize the executive assistants or the VA.
Great points and perfect examples there. Now let's circle back and hit your fourth point that you like to share with people.
Yeah, I think, again, think of the first three. Hiring and onboarding is massive, and having that locked down and tight is huge. The second one, training your team to execute the winning behaviors. That's number two. Three, managing your behaviors, not the numbers. When you've got those three, it's literally just as simple as lather, rinse, repeat. If you've got those three, you will build a high performing sales team. It starts again with great recruiting, hiring, and onboarding. And there you've got to develop them, train them to execute, and then you manage them by, hold them accountable to the execution of the winning behaviors. And if you do those three things, it's literally just lather, rinse, repeat. You could build 10 teams doing exactly that formula over and over and over and over again. So it takes discipline. It takes consistency, and it is a process, right? You've got to build that into your culture. But from a sales team point of view, if you build that into the sales culture, you can't lose. As an entrepreneur, you're going to succeed every time.
Yeah. Now, shifting a little bit to like habits and leadership habits, as things continue to evolve in business today, what's one leadership habit that you think separates the businesses that grow cleanly from the ones that might burn out?
I think when you have a coaching culture, when the leaders adopt a coaching culture, I think that is the difference between the haves and the have-nots in the business world. Coaching, again, I define as helping someone take an existing skill and apply it better, more efficiently, and more effectively. Coaching is not training, and you've got to develop, because what happens in coaching is one-on-one. Training is a kind of a group event, and there's multiple people in there, but coaching is one-on-one, and it does involve a level of professional intimacy, right? You've got to be able to, put on your coaching hat, and you have to have immense trust, because what happens, it's almost like Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in coaching also stays in coaching, and you can't breach the coaching slash managing divide. You can't do that. Like, you can't go, you said this in coaching, and yell at them for something in a sales meeting. That is not allowed. So, I train sales leaders, on how to set a coaching upfront contract, which is, a whole different hat. And it takes time, it takes trust, it takes skill and coordination, but you've got to be able to suspend your positional authority as the boss, because now your coaching hat is on. And the second thing is that you've got to give them permission to speak freely, and then you've got to give them protection. So we call it the 3 Ps. You got to give them protection against reprisal for what they say in the coaching session. If you break that trust, it's going to be impossible to get it back. So the answer to your question is the best from the leadership point of view. The difference between the haves and the have-nots, 100% of the way, is developing a coaching culture where your team, your players actually actively go, hey, I'm struggling with this one piece in the sales puzzle, and then they set up a coaching session. That's the difference.
All right, as we wrap up today, what is one piece of advice you would share with business leaders today that they can execute immediately to start seeing differences in their business?
You've got to get away from the features and benefit, the features and trap. Every time I talk to business owners, I'm like, tell me something, that is amazing about your company, and they will feature and benefit me to death. And the reality is that, think about it from a prospect's point of view. If you're a prospect, you don't care about any of that stuff. So your job as the business owner is to create a culture where you help your salespeople ask the right questions and figure out what's the compelling pain that your prospect would respond to first. Like, and maybe there's a fit, maybe not, but that's my actionable item. Stop pitching and start asking questions and gathering information.
Awesome. Well, Tim, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with our audience today. To everyone listening, this conversation really came down to sales, leadership, and coaching. It all comes back to showing up and actually executing these things. And that's where most things break, not the ideas, not the strategy, it's the follow through, the stuff that's supposed to happen after the call, after the plan, after you've made that decision. And that's why we built Workergenics. We have full-time ultimate executive assistants who stay behind the scenes to make sure things keep moving consistently and without you having to chase it all down. If that's the gap you're feeling right now, head over to workergenics.com. Appreciate you all being here, and we'll see you on the next one.